Hello world, it's Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. This week I want to talk to you about a really interesting Greek word. So for those who didn't know, most of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures was written in Hebrew, and most of the New Testament or the Christian Scriptures are written in Greek. Now normally I'm a Hebrew guy, that's kind of what I love reading about and learning about, but I'm going to teach you a little bit of Greek today. The word of the day is malakoi, which is the plural version of the word malakos, which means soft. Now malakoi, or the versions malakos or malaka, are used 4 times in the New Testament, and 3 of those times they are used in reference to clothing. Just some good old ancient Greek folks talking about laundry, right? Well, today I want to talk about the 4th time that malakoi is used, which is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, because this verse has been used to shame people who are assigned male at birth who express themselves in more stereotypically feminine ways. So let's get a little background on this first. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and is basically telling them about the things they shouldn't do. He starts out with what biblical scholars call a vice list, which is basically this whole list of things you shouldn't do or things that you shouldn't be. He includes all the people that you might find in a local jail, like robbers and thieves and drunkards. And he also includes people who have broken specific commandments, like idolaters, or people that worship idols, and adulterers, or people that cheat on their spouse. All these titles and these Greek words so far are pretty easy for us to understand because we have bits in the rest of the Bible that talk about not worshiping idols, or cheating, or lying, or stealing, or getting fall down drunk all the time. Then Paul mentions 2 other people who won't inherit the kingdom, and these 2 words are very confusing for translators and for people in general. These 2 other kinds of people in Greek are the malakoi and the arsenokoitai. Now you might be wondering 2 things here. First of all, what the heck was that second word I just said? Was that a sneeze? And second of all, why would the word soft, a word associated with clothes, be put on a list of things that people shouldn't be? Now here's the bad news. We don't know for sure what those 2 words mean. Because we don't know for sure, these 2 words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, have been translated into a bunch of different English words over the years because we're just trying to find the right one. Now I'm not going to try to explain arsenokoitai because that is a very complex word and Matthew Vines has done a great job of explaining it, way better than I could do. So if you want to hear Matthew talk about why that word has been translated as homosexual for so long and why that's not accurate, click over here. But what I want to keep talking about is the word malakoi. Who are these malakoi people and why did Paul say that they wouldn't inherit the kingdom of God? So like I said, we know that the word malakoi literally means soft, so as translators have tried to figure out what that means for us today, they have gone through a whole bunch of different English words, and the translation that most Bibles have settled on is effeminate ones. So in at least half the Bible translations out there, we're reading that God doesn't like effeminate people, which is kind of a problem. Translating the word soft as effeminate in English puts a whole bunch of people in a boatload of trouble, including people that are trans, people that are genderqueer, and even cisgender women. Why can't they be feminine? But Paul probably wasn't actually talking to women in his letter to the church at Corinth. He was probably talking to the male people in the church. And when Paul was telling these men not to be soft, he was probably appealing to ancient Stoic standards. So the Stoics believed that to be soft was to let your feelings run away with you, to be constantly running after things that you want and being overwhelmed by emotion and letting other people control you. The ancient Greeks thought that this ability to be controlled by your emotions or to be controlled by other people was a very feminine trait because they thought women were weaker in mind and body in just about every other way. This word soft had nothing to do with gender presentation, it had to do with control and power. The ancient Greeks expected men to man up and be tough and be in control of everything all the time. And Paul even explains that and gives an example of that later on in the chapter when he says, "I will not be dominated by anything." So was Paul telling the men of the church in Corinth that they needed to get their stuff together and just be tough and manly and kick ass and take names because that's what Jesus would want? Well, for hundreds of years, Christians have taken that kind of advice to heart. John Calvin said that God made rules to keep men manly, lest men should degenerate into effeminacy unworthy of their nature. Much earlier than that, Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, said that men had to be kept away from all feminine things, lest they should go into battle and be sluggish in war. Even today in Christian culture, we have tons of books and podcasts and blogs and everything about how men need to be warriors for God, right? And need to be tough and strong and in control all the time. But is Paul's warning about not being soft in 1 Corinthians, does that have anything to do with any of this macho posturing? I don't think so. Even though Paul probably was encouraging the men to keep up with the gender standards of their time, I don't think he was trying to get them to be warmongering machismo factories. And I have this hunch because by the end of chapter 6, Paul is reminding all of the men in Corinth that their bodies are not their own, and that they are essentially slaves to God. So first he's telling them not to be dominated by anything, but then he's telling them that they are dominated by God, and it's a very confusing power dynamic. But what's clear here is that this has nothing to do with gender presentation. What if Paul's not actually feeding into the idea that we need to shame people for acting feminine, and instead is just reminding us that Jesus is Lord, and that God is the one in control? So let's break that down just a little bit more. First of all, let's get rid of the effeminate English translation because it's not accurate. Paul's telling us not to let anything in the world have power over us, not to be dominated or lorded over by the things of this world or our culture. But he is saying that God has power over us, and we do best by recognizing that and becoming humble servants. This isn't about teaching kids not to be sissies. This is about declaring allegiance to God over anything else in this world. People who try to use this verse to shape men into hardened fighting machines aren't doing that for God. Like Clement of Alexandria said, if we let men get soft, who's gonna fight the wars? But that's the voice of empire talking. That's the voice of a culture that cares more about warring over pieces of land and about who's in power than loving God and loving our neighbor. So let's stop beating up on people for being effeminate, because that's not accurate, and it has nothing to do with what Paul is talking about. Throughout the New Testament, we see that becoming part of God's kingdom means lifting up the weak and the poor and the broken and the oppressed, and not becoming the strong man that crushes them down. So if you're a trans or genderqueer person who likes to express themselves in more feminine ways, rest assured, Paul's not talking about you here. But we can all use a reminder that Jesus is Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, then the empire is not. And if Jesus is Lord, gender roles and expectations are not. If Jesus is Lord, then we are not. And we can all use a little dose of humility. Thanks for watching the video this week, everybody. I hope you liked it. If you did, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you back here next Wednesday. Peace.